I asked ChatGPT what are the top 10 hip mobility drills, and in this video, I'm going to rank them. I'll tell you which ones are worth keeping in your routine and which ones are not. I'll also tell you how you can modify some of these drills to get better outcomes and benefits from them. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 10 on the list, we have the butterfly stretch or frog stretch. This is a very common one to target stretching out the hip adductors, and ChatGPT allegedly says this is great for increasing hip width and squat depth because you're kind of rocking back into your hips. The idea is getting in this quadruped position with the knees spread out a lot is going to really stretch out the groin as we sit back into our hips, and our hips are in a very much externally rotated position. This could be helpful, but if the goal is to improve hip mobility, something I think is very important is that the drill should, to some extent, educate us how to move into and own that space throughout the day outside of just that stretch, because a lot of stretches just stretch out muscles, but they don't actually teach our body how to use the new space that we're moving into. So I think this is a decent stretch, but it's not really doing anything special. So I'm going to put this in the C tier. But I do think there's actually an underrated benefit of this frog position. If you have, like a lot of people do, a lot of external rotation of your hips and limited internal rotation, this could be a very helpful exercise. But you need to do it with a slightly different intent. By starting with our hips very externally rotated, we're starting in the space that we have. And by applying pressure down into the ground with the inside of our knee, we start to create a little bit of internal rotation force. This can be helpful for restoring limited internal rotation. This is because we're actually starting in the space that we have and creating internal rotation from there, as opposed to shoving internal rotation onto our body that can't accept that because there's no space for it. Here's how I would coach that. Start in this position with your hands underneath your shoulders, knees underneath your hips. And then what you're gonna do is widen out your knees to a comfortable end range where you don't feel any pinching in your hips. It just feels nice and comfortable. And you're gonna keep your feet together. But you should be able to feel the inside portion of your knee, relatively speaking, resting on the ground. But especially as you drop down to your elbows, widening out your elbows and keeping your hands close together into sort of this shape right here. Your elbows should be wide enough to where you can feel that inside elbow bone flat on the ground. Now here's what you're going to do. Keeping your gaze in between your sort of webs of your hands, you're going to push through the inside edge of your elbows and a little bit through the inside portion edge of your knee. And you're going to just come up off of the ground, just literally a 2 out of 10 effort. And you're gonna feel your shoulder blades separate away from your spine a little bit and maybe a tiny, tiny bit of inner thigh activation. And you're gonna breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth in this position. Again, this is not a stretch. This is trying to improve relative internal rotation space by starting in a lot of external rotation. And by internally rotating into that space, you can improve internal rotation when you have very limited external rotation. So you're just gonna breathe in this position in through your nose, out through your mouth, nice and relaxed, not engaging your neck at all. You're gonna do this for about 2 sets of 8-ish breaths. The next one is the wall-facing squat or toe elevated squat. And the intention behind this is to target the posterior chain, and it's great for developing upright posture in the squat and hip flexion mobility. No. So this is actually kind of garbage in my opinion. This wall-facing squat is just going to promote a lot of compensation, and it's going to promote a lot of the things that people already have problems with. Yes, it is true a lot of people cannot keep an elevated torso as they squat down because in part of poor hip mobility, but also limited ankle mobility. By doing a toe elevation or by facing the wall, what you're doing is promoting more of a hinge-like action in your squat. So this is actually going to be counter to what you really want through a squat, which is a more upright vertical torso and the knees going over the toes. This is going to limit the amount of ankle dorsiflexion you can access, especially if you're elevating the toes. So what I recommend instead is to actually face away from the wall, place a foam roller against the wall, and potentially even elevate your heels on some wedges. And that's not even necessary, but it will help with that ankle mobility element of that squat. So all you need to do is now just pattern a nice upright squat going down and up that foam roller, and you're going to see a lot more benefits for developing better posture in a squat than to face the wall. So for those reasons, I would put this solidly in the F tier, and I would definitely not recommend a lot of people do this. I don't see the benefits in many circumstances. Next on the list, we have a banded hip distraction, either the posterior or anterior, back or front of the hip socket. This is ideal for hip capsule and joint spacing, and also used frequently in functional rehab and mobility circles. Not necessarily bad. I think that banded distractions could be a really good way to open up space, like a lot of traditional stretches, except this is more focused on the joint capsule itself. Now, in many cases, some people have a restriction in the ability for the femur to slide back in the hip socket into internal rotation or forward in the socket into external rotation. In the overwhelming majority of circumstances, I see that people have a harder time getting the femur to slide back in the hip socket. So I'm generally more of a fan of a banded distraction where it's going to allow for the femur to go back in the hip socket to open up that space. But we have to follow it up with something that trains the muscles that help control the rotation of the femur going back into the hip socket. Muscles like our adductors, our gluteus medius, muscles that help create that internal rotation are going to be key here, and we need to train that space. So I do think that this could be a useful tool, but I oftentimes find that people shove themselves into this position too much and they force it, and they really try to seek more sensation rather than a genuine stretch. So if you execute it properly and you do it with the right intention, you follow it up with the right things, I think that this could be useful, but I don't think it's necessarily game changing, because I do think that there are a lot of other ways that you can open up space in your posterior hip capsule that could be more effective under some circumstances. I will link some down below in the description. So for that reason, I'm going to put these banded distractions in the B tier. Number 7, we have the couch stretch, a very popular stretch. And the way they describe it here is it's brutally effective for anterior hip tightness, especially in desk workers. Brutally is very appropriately used there. So this stretch puts a really intense amount of tension on the hip flexor to lengthen it out. We got to be careful with this though. I've seen quite a few people actually strain their hips from trying to force themselves into this position. And this is one of those stretches that I think the internet really likes and people really like because it is so high in sensation. It does provide such a meaningful stretch. So a lot of people think that it's better because it's a bigger stretch, but that's not necessarily true. You see, in some cases, an aggressive stretch is necessary, but for the overwhelming majority of people, getting a huge stretch actually creates more tension within their system and nervous system, which creates this reflexive tightening and tonicity within our bodies because we're under such a large amount of stress. You see, stretching things out can create tension just as contracting things. It's just a different way to create tension. So we have to be careful with this, and we don't want to push ourselves too hard too fast because it can create some potential risks for straining ourselves. That being said, I do think tight hip flexors are a pretty big problem in a lot of people. But again, is it the fact that the hip flexor is the problem, or is the hip flexor tight for a different reason? I talk about this in a lot of my content on anterior pelvic tilt. Typically, the reason why the hip flexors are tight is because the pelvis is shoved forward in space. The center of gravity of the lower body is being pushed forward, which is pushing the pelvis forward with it. This is creating tightness on the front side of the pelvis and subsequently the hip flexors. So the hip flexors are secondary to that. So you can stretch out your hip flexors all day long, but if you're not actually working to teach your pelvis what it means to bring itself back in space and the center of gravity back underneath you, relatively back, then you're always going to have tight hip flexors. I think this is one reason why a lot of people don't see long-term success, and people that stretch out their hip flexors all the time are the ones that complain they're tight all the time, because they're not actually addressing the true root cause and they're just hitting the symptom over and over again. So I think it's a good stretch that hits a problem that a lot of people have, but I do think there are pros and cons to it. So for those reasons I mentioned, we're going to put this in the B tier. The next one is the classic pigeon stretch. Now, this I think can have a lot of benefits, but again, it's one of those things where it's opening up space. Are we going to do stuff to follow it up to open up that space that we just created with the stretch? That's a question that's probably separate from this discussion, but just keep that in mind because that's really important. But what a pigeon stretch is really doing is it's putting you in a deep amount of hip bend, and it's creating a lot of length on the backside of the glutes and the pelvis. But there's a problem with this. this. A lot of people do this stretch really poorly. And so for that reason, I'm going to be ranking it pretty low because of how commonly it's butchered. But there is a better way I'm going to teach you of how to execute this better with more successful outcomes, getting length through the glutes, because that's the idea. By getting deep into this hip flexion position or hip bend position, we're creating more length on the backside of the pelvis. And this is great because actually a lot of people have problems with musculature on the backside of the pelvis that is too tight. The problem I see with the pigeon stretch is that people actually move a lot through the low back and spine rather than getting the genuine length and rotation through the hip to properly and genuinely open up the backside of the pelvis. So people end up just dropping their hips really low and moving into this position where they're, yes, feeling a big stretch, but they're feeling it because they're really just forcing that length through spinal movement rather than the genuine segmental rotation through the hips and the pelvis, which will get the proper amount of length through the glutes that this person can individually tolerate. Otherwise, you're just going to be forcing yourself into a position you probably can't access, and you're not going to get as many benefits. So what I recommend instead is to do it like this. Make sure that you're starting with your hands underneath your shoulders, knees directly underneath your hips. And what you're going to do is straighten out one leg because you're going to stretch the side that's down. Now, pivoting around only your knee, externally rotate or lift up this shin until you reach an end range that's comfortable and you're not forcing it. This is as far as you need to go. Now, drop down to your elbows only like this, and you'll feel a nice solid stretch. Now, with each inhale through the nose and subsequent soft exhale through the mouth, reach your heel back, keeping the ball of your foot down on the ground. Even if you can't get the heel to go back with each and every breath, just have the intention to, and it'll open up your hips more and more. This will be way more genuine of a stretch. Do not let your hips drop like this. In my beginner body restoration program, there's actually several exercises designed in the early phases of the program to open up space in the backside of the hips, like many people struggle with. But then I have exercises that will teach you how to genuinely use that space, which is a huge missing component in so many mobility routines. Not only that, but it also addresses a ton of other common limitations, which will help you feel and move better on a daily basis. So if you want to learn more about that, check that out down below in the description. Now, because 80 to 90% of people don't do this stretch very well, and there's a lot of bad instruction out there, but it does have benefits for an issue that a lot of people have, I'm going to put it in the C tier, right in the middle. The next one is actually an interesting one. So we have a deep goblet squat with rocking, or let's just say a deep squat, maybe holding on to something and rocking back and forth. I actually quite like this. The reason why is that just being in a supported deep squat by yourself has a ton of benefits. Most people can't get into the bottom of a squat without being able to support themselves, and that's totally fine. But by being in a deep squat, what you're really doing is training that mobility to really get deep within your hips, but you're also getting a lot of length through the backside of the pelvis. Remember, we've talked about with things like the pigeon stretch, a lot of people have really compressed backsides of the pelvis and tight glutes, stuff that's really deep within the hips and tight, which is kind of compressing the backside of the pelvis, and that limits our ability to rotate and move genuinely through our pelvis. So by opening that space up, it's actually really helpful, and you can do that effectively in a deep squat. But not only that, by being in a deep squat and rocking back and forth, you get this sort of nice opening and closing of one side. You can kind of isolate one side and then the other. So this is a really good drill, and the feet are fixated to the ground, unlike a lot of these other drills. So you're getting a nice relationship with the ground as well, which I think is really key. And for that reason, I think that this is a great exercise. I'm going to put this in the A tier. One thing I would recommend is that if you have a hard time getting into this position, try elevating your heels on something, and that will take away a restriction in ankle mobility, which would cause you to have a hard time getting into the position. Okay, and the next one we have is the classic, yet I also think infamous, banded clamshell, ideally for glute activation and control and external rotation of the hips. Okay. I can't tell you how many times someone's come into my gym and they're dealing with back pain, knee pain, something within their hips, whatever, and their physical therapist or trainer gives them banded clamshells as just this like blanket approach to try to fix their problem. It's almost as if the entire rehab industry has just agreed in this consensus that when someone has a lower body issue, they need to do a clamshell because their glutes are underactive. I don't think that this is a great way to target the glutes at all. There are so many different problems with this exercise. First, the glute max does not have a huge role in creating abduction of the hip. Yes, it does have that role, but its primary role is to create hip extension. So if you really want to target the glutes effectively, you want the foot fixated to the ground and moving through a position where you're kind of standing up into a position of hip extension where the hip is moving under you. And on that same note, there's not really any specificity for how the glute should work with the rest of the body. If you're just opening your legs over and over again, what are you teaching your body to do? What context are you giving your glute to actually work in? If you really want your glute to work, then you want it to work specifically when it should within the gait and movement cycle, or more specifically to an exercise in the weight room, for example. But these two things are not dissimilar. Essentially what I'm saying is that when the glute creates extension of the hip and it's standing us up, we are pushing through the ground. We are dealing with what we call ground reaction force. So moving into a position of hip extension is really key, and we can do that by feeling the contacts of our heel and base of the big toe. We don't want to lose the outside of the foot, but the big toe in particular has a strong connection to the glute. And if we can do that with our heel on the ground, that is going to really help us cue genuine hip extension as it happens in the actual gait cycle itself. So there's two way better ways to train more specificity of hip extension to the glutes. One I'm going to show you right now, and the other one is a kickstand body weight hinge exercise that I will link down below in the description for you. This will cook your glutes better than any clamshell ever has, and it will be more specific to how you actually should use that glute in the movement cycle. Now, there is a world in which a properly executed clamshell could be helpful for training the external rotation component of your glutes in a potential end range situation. So there is a potential niche use case for a clamshell. I wouldn't even make it my first, second, or third choice, but for that reason, I'm going to put it in the D tier. Moving into the top 3 of the most popular hip mobility exercises, according to ChatGPT, is number 3, hip CARs, or controlled articular rotations. These were popularized by a movement system called functional range conditioning, or FRC. In theory, I actually think they're pretty great. And there's a lot of benefits, both neurologically within your brain, but also biomechanically, of controlling the end range of motion of a specific joint path. So, for example, when we're looking at hip CARs, what you're really trying to do is really intentionally control moving your hip through an end range of motion, potentially in a circle or into flexion or extension, something like that. There are a lot of different variations. I like these in practice, and when executed properly, they're great. But the problem is that a lot of people don't do these right. So they end up just moving a lot and trying to really overemphasize the movement, and they're trying to maximize it, which is the right intention. But if you run out of genuine space in a given range of motion in your hips, you are going to start moving through your spine and your low back. And they think they're moving through their hips, but in reality, they're actually moving through their low back, not actually training the genuine controlled articular rotation. So you got to know what your end range of motion is genuinely, and you got to work through that. And progressively over time, with maybe some other exercises or drills that we've mentioned in this video, open up more space and then train that space. These are really good for training that end range of space and movement, especially in what we would call the open chain, where the foot isn't fixated to the ground. But I do recommend, and I think it's very important, that you do exercises where your foot is actually fixated to the ground, because this is specific to how we actually move. There's a big difference between the foot being off of the ground and moving through some articular rotation like this, or the foot being fixated to the ground and the pelvis and hips moving over that fixated leg. This is a huge component of the movement cycle, so don't forget to do that. I will link a couple of exercises I like for that down below in the description. So there are very few things, in my opinion, that are better for really owning a new end range of motion that someone has opened up or got new access to, but you got to make sure you do it right. So for those reasons, I do love these. I'm going to put these in the A tier. Next one we have is a single leg deadlift, and they're not super specific about it, but I'll help us out in a second with this. But the idea is to target the posterior chain and also open up the hips, used by athletes commonly. So love this. And so they weren't super specific with it, like I mentioned, so I'm going to kind of slide my own interpretation of this in there, and we're going to work with an exercise I mentioned earlier, which is the kickstand single leg deadlift. You can do this with just your body weight. And if you do this properly, there are very few things that will not only target your glutes extremely effectively, but also work your hips into deep ranges of hip bend, which is internal rotation of the hips, which is what a lot of people don't have a lot of access to. But then you can really push through the floor and get yourself to move into a nice end range of hip extension. There are two things most people are missing. It's hip extension, the end range of it, and hip internal rotation. So this targets both of those extremely effectively with a lot of key specificity as to how we actually move as humans. I love this drill. You gotta learn how to do it right though. So if you're gonna learn one drill from this, I recommend it's this one. Learning how to do a good hinge is just absolutely game changing for the overwhelming majority of people to feel better in their hips, their low back, and even within their knees as they move throughout the day, as they work out in the gym. It's just a total game changer. So for that reason, I'm going to put this in the S tier. Almost everyone would benefit from doing this effectively multiple times per week. And if you want to learn how to do this perfectly, I'm going to link my tutorial down below in the description. And now the number one most popular hip mobility drill according to ChatGPT is 90-90 hip switches. The reason why is it says it targets hip internal and external rotation, teaches dissociation between the hips, easy to scale or regress. So yeah, that is true. However, I think we need to consider a couple of key variables here. Again, the foot isn't fixated to the ground here. You could say the leg is fixated to the ground to a certain extent at the end range position, but this is more of like an open chain exercise where you are kind of just moving your femur within the hip socket like this. It's missing a component of the pelvis really moving over the femur in a genuine way, which is a lot of the movement cycle. Not necessarily a bad thing, just something to consider. And a lot of you may be surprised to hear that I actually don't think a lot of people have the genuine space to move into a 90-90 switch effectively without compensating a lot through their low back. Because what does a 90-90 switch actually need? On the front leg, you need to move into hip flexion and a lot of external rotation. And on the back leg, it's going to be more hip extended and internally rotated. So you need to be able to access extension on the back leg with a decent amount of flexion on the front leg. Now, a lot of people don't actually have either of those, let alone the ability to access them on both sides at the same time. Now, you could, in theory, regress this by not having your legs as far apart from each other and bringing them in closer to the midline. Could be helpful, but I don't think this is as game-changing as a lot of people think it is. I think most people would actually be better off addressing these things in isolation. Like, for example, if you're limited in extension of the hip, then train that extension of the hip. If you're limited in internal rotation, try to do that on one side in particular to focus on it. It's already hard enough to try to improve internal rotation of the hip without thinking about doing something else on the other leg that's completely different. So for that reason, I don't think that this is a bad drill, and it could be helpful to integrate some stuff later on when you get access to more space, but just as something that would be like a go-to every single day, I don't think that it is a top tier exercise. For that reason, I'm putting it in the C tier. All right, technically we got to the end of the video, but I just couldn't help myself. Honestly, there's a couple of more that I feel like people are gonna ask about, so we're gonna hit them. And we're gonna kind of put it all in one sort of umbrella, but the one that came up on ChatGPT later was a band assisted supine hamstring stretch. Okay, this is another one of those things where it's like, do you ever notice how people that stretch their hamstrings the most also complain that they're tight the most frequently? The reason why they're tight is because they're oftentimes not addressing the true root cause. If their pelvis is tilted forward like this, like a lot of people have, most of the population has some degree of anterior pelvic tilt. It's not inherently a bad thing. It's just a thing that we all are dealing with for the most part. If your pelvis is tilted forward, the hamstring gets pulled on, and there's tension now in the hamstring. So they suspect that that tension is being caused by the hamstring being too short, but the hamstring is actually in too long of a position. So they end up trying to stretch their hamstrings over and over again, but they're just exacerbating the issue more and more as the pelvis goes more and more forward. So it's not necessarily a helpful solution. What most people actually benefit from is actually getting the hamstrings to control the tilt of the pelvis, bringing it back in space more. And that is actually going to help them get stress off of that tight hamstring, because now the hamstring is resting in a more neutral position as opposed to being tugged on all the time. One of my favorite exercises for that is a classic 90-90 hip lift exercise, which I will link down below in the description if you want to try that out for yourself. That being said, I do think dynamic hamstring stretching could be helpful in an athletic context and a warm-up setting, But I think most people that are trying to stretch out their hamstrings are doing it with not necessarily the right idea and intention in mind. And also, I think a lot of people that do stretch out their hamstrings are doing it in way too much range of motion, and they're forcing a lot of movement, which ends up, as we've talked about in this video, happening through the low back. So for that reason, I'm going to put these in the D tier. And finally, we're going to end on a very popular one called the world's greatest stretch. Now, this has a lot going on within it. You've got hip extension on the back leg, a big stretch of the hip flexors, you're getting into your hip on the front leg, and you're working through a lot of thoracic spine mobility. All in all, I think that there could be some real value to that. It does help people feel better, and generally it's great in a warm-up environment. However, it's one of those exercises, again, where I think most people don't realize just how little genuine range of motion that they do have. And so this is all a spectrum we have to consider. So this exercise ends up being a lot of orientation-driven movement, meaning that you're not really genuinely moving fully through your hips, and you're using a lot of low back to get into that position, or upper back to get in that position, which is not necessarily a bad thing, again, but for strict mobility of the hips, I think it is really honestly promoting a lot of compensation rather than the genuine articular rotations like this. It's really just a lot of back movement. That being said, though, I do think it drives some nice end range of length through a lot of muscles that tend to get tight, which could have value, and I do like the thoracic spine rotation component of it. So for that reason, I will put it in the B tier. If you guys like the tier list content in this type of video, it would mean a lot to me if you could let me know by liking the video, leaving a comment down below of what you want to see me rank next, and also don't forget to subscribe and ping that notification bell because I release new videos every single week.